Golgo 13 is a Japanese manga series created by Takao Saito in 1968. The series continues to this day, making it the longest-running manga of all time. The protagonist is sometimes known as Duke Togo. That's not Tugo, this isn't a Chinese restaurant, but he's better known by his titular codename, Golgo 13. Togo is an enigmatic and highly skilled professional assassin. The series is renowned for its gritty realism, complex stories, and focus on political intrigue and espionage. You can draw many parallels between Duke Togo and James Bond, as this ad even states, which makes sense because the series' creator, Takao Saito, previously created a serialized 007 series based on Ian Fleming's James Bond novels 4 years before creating Golgo 13. Again, we're dealing with a professional assassin here, and his real name, age, and birthplace are unknown. No intelligence agency in the world has any clue about his true identity, like the Zodiac Killer or Banksy. Now, the name Duke Togo is just an alias he frequently uses to accept jobs. He doesn't talk much, shows very little emotion when carrying out his assassinations, and will kill anyone who threatens to expose him. The name Golgo 13 actually references the death of Jesus Christ. Golgo is short for Golgotha, or Golgotha, the site of Jesus' crucifixion. The use of 13 is likely due to its superstitious association with bad luck. His logo, cool-looking skeleton wearing a crown of thorns, further adds to his dark, Messiah-like mythos. As you can imagine, the content of Golgo 13 is largely adult-oriented. Both the manga and the anime films feature significant amounts of violence and nudity, so it's a bit surprising that Nintendo entertained the idea of Duke Togo being represented on their system, but Nintendo doesn't often shy away from profitable opportunities, and Golgo 13 was quite the popular property in Japan at the time. Thus, on the NES, we got Golgo 13 Top Secret Episode in 1988, and a sequel, The Mafat Conspiracy, in 1990. And for fun, the Japanese title of these games are Golgo 13 Twilight of the Gods and Golgo 13 The Riddle of Icarus. I particularly love this ad for Golgo 13 on the NES blasting Secret Agent Man. Check it out.
Top Secret Golgo 13 by Vic Tokai for your Nintendo Entertainment System.
So yeah, playing these games always seemed kind of intimidating to me. Based on what I had seen, they always looked confusing, tedious, and graphically underwhelming, and it turns out I wasn't entirely wrong. If you've felt the same way, trust me, they aren't as convoluted as you might think. Hopefully this video can help you make sense of them and enjoy the experience. Just know there's no shame in looking up guides and maps and walkthroughs online when you inevitably get stuck. Now, let's grab our finest trench coat and see what's up. Golgo 13 cycles between a few different modes of play as you progress through the story. One is a side-scrolling adventure mode, where you just walk down the street, interact with the occasional NPC, get shot at by random bad guys, and deal with motorcycle gangs, a day in the life. The objective here is to find the next place to go, as several of the drab buildings in the background can be entered and are meaningful to the story. Unfortunately, they're not labeled in any way, and purposefully so, as these sections are apparently meant to be tedious hunt and find ordeals. Now, occasionally you'll be transported into a gallery shooting sequence where you can turn 360 degrees and aim a reticle at enemies using the D-pad. These sections are over pretty quickly. All you have to do is locate the enemies that are listed along the bottom and eliminate them. And sometimes there are helicopters, sometimes they're just bad guys shooting at you on foot doing backflips. And in other parts of the game, like in the underwater levels, these modes are similar, but involve different types of targets like scuba diving bad guys. Now there's yet another shooting stage variant, where you have to snipe an enemy, which aligns more with Duke Togo's reputation as an assassin, but these sequences don't appear to be timed. All you have to do is scan the area for the target, zoom in, and fire. Now, whenever Golgo 13 changes locations, there's usually a flying or swimming section in between. You'll move horizontally from left to right in a shoot-'em-up sequence, taking out other planes and dodging their fire. Now, these sections aren't too difficult. Most of the enemies can be dispatched rather easily by rapidly pressing your fire button. Your life and ammo are shown in the upper left, and eliminating enemies will build up your life and ammo meters rather quickly, and that's true for this and the beat-'em-up sections. Now, the last mode is the 3D mazes, which are quite confusing to navigate. All the walls look the same, so you can get turned around and lost pretty quickly. The manual includes a map and layout, which is somewhat helpful, but the mazes are really elaborate. The manual even suggests using graph paper to chart out your own map. And as you progress, walls will sometimes pop up right in front of you, requiring you to use grenades to destroy them so you can continue on. And occasionally, the floor will drop out, landing you in a basement that you'll have to navigate through to find your way out of. And you can only hold 3 grenades, but you can replenish the ones that you've used simply by defeating other enemies. There's also a tricky laser barrier you'll come to, but you'll first need to locate a special pair of infrared binoculars in order to see those lasers. But even when visible, the lasers are tough to pass through unscathed because they require really precise timing to figure out. But if you take some damage, just hunt down an armed enemy, get rid of them, and they'll always restore a little bit of your health. Now, as you'd expect, these Golgo 13 games are very narratively driven. Now, the premise here is that the CIA is transporting a top-secret bacteriological weapon via helicopter when it suddenly explodes near the Statue of Liberty. The vaccine that's apparently on board was supposed to be in the wreckage, but was never found. Now, the CIA blames our guy, Golgo 13, for the act, believing only an expert sharpshooting sniper like him could have taken out the helicopter in such a manner. The CIA suspects Golgo 13 is working with the Soviet KGB on this act of terrorism. However, a secret international intelligence group known as Fixer, suspect, transmits a message suggesting this wasn't Golgo 13's doing, but rather the work of the Drek Empire, a well-known terrorist group. Why didn't we assume then first? But it's up to Golgo 13 to trot around the globe, dodge CIA and KGB agents, and then eliminate Drek terrorists while identifying and taking down their leader. All in all, not a bad premise for an NES game, and right in line with a typical Golgo 13 manga storyline. I've said Golgo so many times, I don't even know if I'm saying it right anymore. And you'll want to follow the story and dialogue closely, as the clues they provide are essential for figuring out where to go next. Even though the areas to explore are relatively small, navigating them can be tedious. Since none of the buildings are marked, it's easy to miss the one you're looking for. I recommend trying to enter every building and subway station you encounter, and then jotting down their locations. This will save you some time later when you gotta backtrack, as it helps to know where you've been. Now, generally, once you find where you're supposed to go, a cutscene will play out, often starting with Golgo 13 giving the camera a "you're probably wondering how I got here" look before another character enters the scene to provide a clue or message. And because you'll spend a lot of time figuring out where to go next, the game can take a while to complete for first-time players. And there are no passwords or save features, but the game does offer 52 continues. And if you're wondering why the rather specific 52, well, there's actually a neat reason. It's because the game is literally called Golgo 13 The Top Secret Episode, akin to a weekly television episode, and you essentially have a year's worth of weekly telecasts to complete the mission. At least, that's the best explanation I could find. Now, the game isn't so difficult that you die constantly, as defeating enemies restores some health, but deaths do add up. You're likely to burn through all 52 continues on your first playthrough simply due to engaging with enemies while searching for your next objective. That's why I recommend having a guide handy if you get stuck, along with taking some of your own notes. While this might detract from the experience in other games, here I feel like it actually enhances it. Graphically, the game is inconsistent, and overall, man, I gotta say below average. The character sprites in the side-scrolling city sections are basic and stiff, poorly animated, but the cutscenes are a nice touch. For example, when a pretty lady takes Golgo 13 back to her room, well, you can fill in the blanks as to why. They were probably playing Scrabble. Either way, his night with her refills his health. So actually, maybe they were playing the game of life together. Anyway, the shooter sections are very basic in graphical quality, with tiny sprites and noticeable flicker. The real eye-catchers are the 3D sections. While drab and simplistic by today's standards, were impressive back in the day. Now, the soundtrack here isn't bad, featuring over 20 quality tracks that fit the game's atmosphere well. A lot of the tracks are very repetitive, some of them are a little hard on the ears, but there's a handful that I really dig, especially the title theme. All in all, Golgo 13 is more approachable than it seems, even if you're unfamiliar with the source material. It can be cryptic at times, like many NES games, but its varied gameplay, engaging story, more mature content, and rather good soundtrack make it a quality and novel experience on the system. Now that said, there is some friction, such as Golgo 13's inability to crouch and shoot, a disadvantage since enemies always crouch to shoot, the occasional lack of clarity about where to go next, and the game's considerable length. It's divided into 13 acts, which is great that it offers plenty of content, but requires the patience of an assassin and the persistence of a world-class spy to overcome. Now, overall, it's a solid game, with rough edges that will appeal to some players and be an easy pass for others. Now, on to the sequel. Now, at first glance, you'll immediately notice the graphical upgrade over the original. The game boasts more detailed sprites and backgrounds, improved animations, and, check it out, you can now shoot while ducking, which is a welcome addition given the number of crouching ninjas lurking around in this sequel. You also gotta appreciate how cool Duke Togo is, walking around fighting bad guys with his hands in his pockets. Now, the side view, street, walking sections, I guess we could just call them beat-em-up sections, are slightly more linear this time. You can still pop in and out of buildings, usually to fight an enemy and pick up a power-up, but the goal is typically to reach the end of the road for the next sequence. Street enemies are noticeably more aggressive now, often teaming up to take you out. Some areas allow you to jump to higher levels to engage with even more enemies. However, despite being a highly trained genius assassin, you inexplicably cannot walk around fire hydrants. You gotta jump over them. Notably missing here are the horizontal scrolling shooter levels from the first game, like the plane and the scuba segments. However, the 3D mazes return, and boy, are they a challenge. If you think you can get through these without referencing a map, you're kidding yourself. The first act ends with a 3D maze spanning 4 floors filled with enemies, a complex layout, a boss fight, and an escape timer. Thankfully, Vic Tokai included detailed maps in the manual, and I cannot stress enough how essential these are. And even with the maps, the maze can be a confusing labyrinth of endless headache-inducing gray walls that all look the same. After reaching the maze's endpoint, you'll face off against a boss. Now, fortunately, the game features infinite continues, and death only sends you back to the start of a sequence most of the time. This means that if you die during this boss fight, you'll restart at the boss instead of repeating the entire maze. A true mercy, because if you had to redo the maze every time, the game would feel far more punishing and would have been chucked across many a lawn back in the day. However, after defeating the boss, you must backtrack out of the maze while racing against the clock. A single wrong turn can cost you precious time, and if you fail at this, instead of starting from where you defeated the boss, the game makes you go through the entire maze again and face the boss again. This is quite the setback landmine, and pretty jarring to experience. Sniping sequences also make a return, and while they never seem to last long enough to enjoy, they now include added mechanics like accounting for wind speed and direction. There's a new mode here too, the 3D Ferrari action sequence, which looks a lot like Outrun without a blonde sidekick. To me, it feels a bit like Road Blasters, which I've reviewed here before. Here, you toss grenades at enemy vehicles and dodge their attacks while racing to your destination within a time limit. You'll want to maintain maximum speed and monitor the RPM gauge in order to shift gears appropriately, which takes a little practice. This is probably the most fun part of the game, at least for me, so having to replay it if you fail isn't too bad. So there you go, the game is divided into these 4 main gameplay types: side-scrolling beat-em-up sequences, 3D mazes, sniping, and driving. And once again, the narrative plays a significant role, and the cutscenes are beautifully animated, but they can drag on, often spanning 3 to 5 minutes of just continuous dialogue. Thankfully, you can skip these with the select button, which I normally wouldn't recommend for such a story-laden game, but my goodness, maybe the most frustrating part of the cutscenes is the repetitive music. It's really hard to listen to for very long. Check it out. And similarly, the 3D maze music is just as grating, which is especially unfortunate since you'll spend a lot of time lost in there. The rest of the stage music throughout the game teeters between fine and completely unremarkable. I don't mean to slag on the soundtrack too much, it's all subjective of course. There is a lot of music here and some of it is good, but a stronger soundtrack could have really improved the experience for both games. Now this game is divided into 5 acts, but they individually take much longer to complete than the 13 acts in the first game. Between the protracted cutscenes and the time-consuming mazes, even players who know what they're doing can expect it to take around an hour to beat. New players, however, will likely spend much longer figuring this one out, and unfortunately, once again, there are no save points or passwords. Now thankfully, the infinite continues do make the challenges here more manageable, and some sections of the game are way more challenging than anything in its predecessor. I had to cheese the bosses to beat them, the mazes demand constant map checking, and certain enemies in the latter beat-em-up sections are particularly annoying, like the scorpions, and even some of the jumps, especially toward the end of the game, have to be pixel perfect. Now once again, I dig the premise. This time, a terrorist group has knocked America's Strategic Defense Initiative satellite out of orbit, causing it to crash into the Alps. The terrorists then threaten to destroy all American and Russian satellites unless they are given a submarine carrying nuclear warheads. You know what? And at that point, I say just get rid of the satellites. There's no way we're giving terrorists nuclear weapons. And apparently, that's what the government here in the game said too. But this kerfuffle ultimately creates tension between the Americans and the Soviets. Oh boy, as if we needed any more of that. And the Mafat Revolutionary Group claims responsibility for the attack. So, it's up to Golgo 13 to uncover the group's leader and eliminate the threat. Can you save the world from certain doom? Well, you're gonna have to. You're our only hope. Golgo 13, Top Secret Episode, and the Mafat Conspiracy are certainly unique entries in the system's library. These highly story-driven games feature a serious tone, espionage themes, and even hotel mistresses. While the alternating modes of play, quality cutscenes, and strong narrative offer plenty to appreciate, both games are undeniably rough around the edges. The level designs are often bland and confusing. The gameplay modes, despite their variety, feel repetitive and uninspired, and neither game responds particularly well to player inputs. As someone not emotionally tied to the source material, I can't definitively say how well these games cater to Golgo 13 fans. However, I suspect the stories are fleshed out enough that admirers of the series may find some charm here. Fortunately, you don't need to play these games in any specific order, so if I had to choose, I'd slightly recommend the Mafat Conspiracy over Top Secret Episode, even with its steeper difficulty spikes. That said, both games have a similar mix of strengths and weaknesses, so the experience largely balances out. For fans of Golgo 13 looking to explore more Duke Togo games, there are a few other titles worth mentioning. There are others that I'm not going to list here, but ones I'm more familiar with include 1984's Golgo 13 for the SG-1000, which is a scrolling shooter where, instead of assassinating villains, Duke is out rescuing people. Additionally, 2 Golgo 13 games were released for the PlayStation 1 in Japan. There's Golgo 13 Volume 1 Carlisle no Yabo, and Volume 2 Mienai Guntai. These are visual novels styled like animated comic books, and the good news is they include options for English voice acting and subtitles. Well, that's going to do it for Golgo 13 Top Secret Episode and the Mafat Conspiracy on the NES. Now, as always, go ahead and walk around the fire hydrants. And thanks for watching.